We all know how we're bored by the person in private life who explains and expounds. What reason have we to suppose that children are not equally bored? They try to tell us that they are by wandering eyes, inanimate features, fidgeting hands and feet, by every means at their disposal, and the kindly souls among us think that they want to play or be out of doors, but they have no use for play, except at proper intervals. What they want is knowledge, conveyed in literary form, and the talk of the facile teacher leaves them cold. Hi, and welcome to the Book Bar, where everything bookish is on the menu. I'm Ann Jeanette Barr, and today I'm doing a collaboration with another YouTuber, Nina from Everyday Blessings. She's a homeschool YouTuber, and while this is a booktube channel, this prompt of hers was very appropriate. So we're going to be talking about homeschooling without textbooks. I saw this at the store the other day, and it's about the most homeschool thing ever. It's mocha java coffee kombucha. So that seems very appropriate for the conversation we're about to have, all about teaching our own children. We need a lot of this. Nina from Everyday Blessings, whom I'll link below, invited us to share our curriculum plans for the year 2021-2022. And while I will share that in the course of this video, I wanted to talk specifically about how I homeschool my 4 children and the types of things that we use. And then later on in the video, I might get into some specifics for those of you who are really looking for something to implement. But I did think that all of us who love books would be interested in this conversation. That slightly controversial quote that I shared at the beginning is from Charlotte Mason, specifically volume 6 of her collected writings, which is a philosophy of education, or on a philosophy of education, or toward a philosophy of education. And the purpose of her volume 6 was to share the things that she had learned as an educator over her whole career, and how she had gone on to implement a kind of countercultural curriculum in England about 100 years ago for students of all types. And there was it was mostly a class issue that poor students either couldn't go to school or wouldn't be educated the same as more wealthy students, and she fought against that. She also fought against some of the modes of education that were popular at the time, which are still popular now in some cases. So if you're not familiar with Charlotte Mason, I'll talk a little bit more about her later, but I wanted to read another couple of passages just to help you understand why I choose not to use textbooks and why I choose to use literature. She says, "The way to mind is a quite direct way. Mind must come in contact with mind through the medium of ideas." The next page she says, "Our business is to give children the great ideas of life, of religion, history, science, but it's the ideas we must give, clothed upon with facts as they occur, and we must leave the children to deal with these as he chooses." She talks over and over again about presenting these ideas through literature, and she says, "Children see for themselves in their own minds a far more glorious and indeed more accurate presentation than we can afford in our miserable daubs. They read between the lines, and they put in all that the author has left out." And she's talking about reading literature as opposed to kind of a step-by-step textbook that would offer you all of the facts systematically. A lot of homeschoolers who use Charlotte Mason's methods focus on offering their children what's called living books. And I love this idea, and I love when I hear someone use this, I automatically know they're my people. A living book, to give a very broad overview, is a book that inspires more learning. It's a book that is written in a narrative style. So that means like a conversation or like a story being told rather than a list of facts or something very dry or technical. And it brings the ideas that it presents to life through relating those ideas to life, everyday life, the people in the stories, and how these ideas are applied normally and naturally. So just a little bit of background about me and my homeschooling. My oldest child is 13, my youngest is almost 6, And I've been homeschooling the whole way through, with the exception of sending one child to a Montessori school for one semester. And I didn't always know that I would homeschool, but I've always been interested in homeschooling. I started exploring the idea of homeschooling before my children were even born, but it was probably 2009 or 10 when I had two children probably that were still little, earlier than school age, that I started asking people questions and really trying to wrap my head around this homeschooling thing to see if it was even something that I wanted to try. And I had a really great friend who I knew had been a teacher before she homeschooled her children, and her children were all doing well. And she and I have similar personalities in a lot of ways, so I, sat her down and asked her all my questions and said, I've been doing research and there's so many different ways to homeschool, and I'm not trained in teaching or pedagogy, so what in the world do I do? How do I ever make a decision? And she and I talked through my different preferences and the things that made me excited about possibly homeschooling, and she said, I really think you should check out Ambleside Online. She said, it's really literature-based and it's free. Those two things definitely piqued my interest because books are great, obviously, but also my husband was working multiple jobs, going through grad school, or maybe he had just graduated, but working hard to put money, into our pockets. And I had only been working shortened hours or from home since I had children. So one of the intimidating things about homeschooling for me was buying all the books or resources that we would need. So I did check out Ambleside Online, and I have been using it almost exclusively from the beginning. So I'll definitely link that in the comments. But I'm definitely kind of a person who doesn't like to be boxed in. And so I was wary of settling on any one curriculum, and I knew that I was going to want to pull from different resources because I wanted my kids to have the best, not to just check off boxes, which was part of my motivation for not putting them in a school, whether it be public or private, was that I wanted to be able to tailor their education to them. So I definitely tried multiple curricula in the beginning, and I have always supplemented a little bit, but Ambleside Online is our core, and the longer I use it, the closer I stick to the schedule. So it's really excellent. I could just stop the video here and say, go check out Ambleside Online and do what they do, and that would be fine. But I'm going to talk specifically about how Ambleside and also the Charlotte Mason philosophy enables me to homeschool my children with literature and without textbooks. I have a stack of books from various years here that I'm going to use as illustrative examples for how we teach different subjects with literature. And I want to read a couple of favorite quotes from other people, not just Charlotte Mason here, that I think you'll enjoy. First is from Tommy DePaula, who is amazing and just passed away this last year. Reading is important because if you can read, you can learn anything about everything and everything about anything. And from Louis L'Amour, a parent or teacher has only his lifetime, but a good book can teach forever. And this one leads us into this stack. It is, historical novels are without a question the best way of teaching history, for they offer the human stories behind the events, and they leave the reader with a desire to know more. Those last two quotes were from Education of a Wandering Man by Louis L'Amour. So I know one of the questions you're going to want me to address is, do we really not use a math textbook? And my answer is, we really do use a math textbook, but not everyone does. So I'll leave that to the end to tell you kind of the different ways people do math using the Charlotte Mason philosophy, or just using less traditional methods. But full disclosure, that is the one textbook that we currently use, and we haven't always used a textbook, but that's where we've settled. So I'll put a timestamp for the math discussion, which will be after this general discussion. That Louis L'Amour quote is probably what hooked me on the idea of using literature for subjects other than literature and English and, the things that are tangentially related to English literature class, because I wanted to love history as a child, and I just didn't. I found it dry and confusing. That was the most frustrating part. I felt like I was a smart kid and I could retain most information that was presented to me in context, but history always felt like it was presented out of context, and that was so frustrating because I felt like it's it's sequential, it's history. It should make sense to me. I should know from the beginning of time until now in order, and it's never taught in order. I think part of it is because we switch from teacher to teacher throughout our entire education. Every teacher has different methodologies, so even if they were to coordinate and teach sequentially, which they don't necessarily, most places, right? They teach it differently, and they might highlight different aspects or, use different books that teach in a slightly different order, and some will overlap or there may be gaps. And also, we can't remember everything from when we were little, so there's, some repetition that needs to happen, right? So I was really concerned with homeschooling that I find a history program that would help my children actually remember history. I was actually pretty skeptical when I realized that Ambleside doesn't have a history spine in most years. There are some books that are specifically history stories and kind of highlights, different moments in history, but you don't read all of them. You don't start them from the beginning and read through. So I was really worried that I would end up with the same situation. But what I found is my children retain history so much better than I ever did, because we don't just teach them a series of facts and expect them to plug them in their place and remember them without any kind of understanding of the scope of history. My 6-year-old doesn't even understand that, 100 years, depending on who you ask, is a really long time or a really short time. He can't fathom 2,000 years, right? What they remember is when you put people and their stories into those times with a full setting behind them so that they can then place them and other people like them at the same time and start to build this cohesive picture of world history. I honestly feel like I didn't even get this for myself until I started reading historical fiction to my children. So using really great historical fiction titles helps them to identify with a specific person in that time and learn about the struggles of that period of history as if it was being told to them by a friend. So for history, we go through a chronological cycle of history from ancient times to modern times, but rather than just learning facts, we read the stories and then we do a timeline. So you don't need a textbook for this or to buy a specific curriculum for this. There are lots of ideas online, but it could just be a notebook with each page being 100 years or something. When we encounter things that we know happened in history, we plug them into our timeline. We have actually an accordion style timeline that took me forever to put together, but I only had to do it once. And I have used some clip art, and we've used some just writing and also some stickers that I've picked up. And once a week, we just go through and we try and think of who we've read about this week and put it in context. And then it spans the whole room. So we can see, oh, this happened at the same time Shakespeare was alive. Cool. And, ding, more context, right? So we do more than just read. When we read, we take some time to narrate back what we just read to kind of solidify it in our head. And then once a week, we put it on our timeline. And every once in a while, we'll also get reinforcement from our writing assignments. If they are doing copywork, I may pull it from one of their books that they're reading. And so it will just reinforce maybe an idea. But for the most part, just having things told to them in context makes them learn it way better. And also because the living book that really grabs their interest and holds it, they want to know more about that time period, and they're very likely to then go on and pick up the things that I offer them for free reading that have to do with the same time period. And then of course we do read multiple books for each time period, so they are getting some compare and contrast as well. We also get multiple disciplines covered just by reading really good fiction. It doesn't have to be historical fiction, just classic fiction or really well-written books cover a lot of different subjects. So reading something like The Hobbit is an excellent exercise in all kinds of vocabulary, and also it's an engaging story that will help them be better writers later. It really shows them what good writing is, in addition to inspiring their imagination and giving them heroes to look up to. And speaking of heroes, that is a really good place to stop for a second and talk about the subjects that aren't necessarily on tests. Character building and integrity and courage and all of those things are important, and one of the great things about homeschooling is that you can emphasize those a little bit more, which parents should be doing, no matter no matter how their children are schooled, but you can integrate it into your schooling. When you homeschool, it doesn't have to be a separate subject or time that you're having these conversations, and I find that they're a lot less awkward to have when you're talking about a book. So even if you don't homeschool, literature is such a great way to bring up things that you really want to impart to your children, but you don't want to have a kind of, now let's have a talk, son, conversation. So books like Understood Betsy, where there's a spoiled little girl who is afraid to dirty her fingers and thinks she can't do anything, and learns that she actually has so much agency and intelligence, and not only that, but she has to do things herself or they don't count for the future. Betsy has to learn that people aren't going to do things for her forever. And of course, we have the opportunity to learn all kinds of lessons from our favorite classics and our favorite myths. And the children always enjoy these things that they'll hear come up again and again. They'll hear about King Arthur, they'll hear about the Round Table and knights and Lancelot, and they'll actually know what's being talked about, and they won't just have to guess or, rely on some vague kind of pop culture understanding of this literature. They can actually have full participation in the conversations that they, catch when they've read these classics. Another kind of book that we read that covers multiple subjects is biographies. So I think we read almost as many biographies as we do historical fiction, and probably the same amount of literature as well. So it's probably fairly well spread out between these three types of books with just a few others mixed in. So biographies can really introduce you to any subject. So here's one that would maybe, introduce us to history. And this is actually, I suppose it would be called historical fiction rather than a biography, although it is about one person, Amos Fortune. He was an African prince brought over to North America by slave traders, and this chronicles his life. So it's obviously going to cover history, but also all kinds of ethics and politics, right? And it's an inspiring story. So it covers a lot of bases. And these books, which are more obviously biographical, Michelangelo and Gregor Mendel, The Friar Who Grew Peas, are two examples of picture books that I still read to my older children. So Diane Stanley is a favorite picture book author who writes, it's quite word heavy, beautiful biographies of important people with really engaging illustrations that even my older ones don't mind looking through. And then this is another example of picture books that I still allow my older kids to go through and would use in our homeschool all the way up to, 4th or 5th grade. But then, of course, we have lots and lots of biographies that are just chapter book biographies. But the biographies that we choose are well written. And, a biography, to be anything other than just a short summary of someone's life, does have to do a little bit of creative retelling, right? And it tells the story from either a literary standpoint, so it almost feels like it's unfolding right as it happens, or if it's looking backward, it still shares lots of anecdotes and stories, and often things from the lives of other people who were alive at that time, and more context than just saying George Washington was president and blah, 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 blah. You get a lot more context from well-written biographies than you do from a blurb in a textbook or an encyclopedia entry. I often teach science the same way, with either biographies of scientists like Gregor Mendel, but we've done George Washington Carver, Albert Einstein, Isaac Newton, lots and lots of biographies, but also through books that tell the story of a specific scientific topic. So in this case, this is Great Inventors and Their Inventions by Frank P. Bachman. And it tells in a narrative way kind of the history of inventions. And this one is The Secret of Everyday Things by Fabre. And it actually tells the story of commonplace items: needles, matches, soap, yarn, just things that we use a lot all the time. It tells how they're created, like the invention process, or the historical, the traditional ways of making them. When it's something like matches, and it goes into detail about exactly, the chemical reaction that happens. And it tells it in just this almost whimsical, super engaging, interesting way. And he has written quite a few of the books that we use in our curriculum, including the Storybook of Science and the Wonder Book of Chemistry. So, oftentimes we'll find an author like this that has written these narrative style books, even though they're, old enough to be in the public domain, which is one of the reasons that the curriculum is free. You can read a lot of these books without ever having to purchase them. I am a physical copy sort of person, and so I have over the years accumulated a lot of these books, but I could read them online, or I could check them out from the library. Also, there are some authors like Clancy Halling, who do picture books that are the most engaging stories that pack in so many details. It always floors me. And a lot of times you can find these used copies for very cheap or free. This one is about a hermit crab named Pagoo, and it goes all the way from the beginning of his life as a little tiny speck floating in the ocean to, the saga of finding a new shell and battling other hermit crabs. And it's like such a tiny part of the world brought into sharp focus through a story about one little tiny part, of that world, one little hermit crab that we follow. And yet I think my kids and I learned more biology and ocean science principles from this book than almost any other. And it's just such an interesting phenomenon that when we're told a story about a crab instead of facts about a crab, we identify with this little creature, and that makes us internalize the information in a completely different way than just watching a cool nature, documentary, which we do plenty of that too. And for the older kids, there are things that we learn like civics and government that we learn from primary sources, so you don't need a textbook to read the Constitution, right? And also from historical sources like Plutarch. We start reading Plutarch in 4th grade, and Plutarch is an ancient biographer, and he tells all kinds of fascinating stories about the lives of people in this case, the Roman Empire. The language is so challenging that we almost take it paragraph by paragraph when we first start in 4th grade, because there's so much going on, and it was written so long ago about people that we can't relate to almost at all, that it's a pretty intense exercise just to get our brains around it. But by the time children are in 6th or 7th grade, they're reading this as if they were reading the Boxcar Children, and it blows my mind that my kids as preteens can get through Plutarch. But they can, because we have been working so hard to cultivate a proficiency in reading, and it hasn't really even been a chore because we're reading such great books. We also start reading Bulfinch's mythology. First we read Age of Fable, which is Greek mythology, and then later on we'll be going into more contemporary myths in Age of Chivalry. I had to look that up, which starts in 7th grade with tales like Arthur. And this is also really challenging language. And again, when we started in 4th grade, that, the kids are having a hard time hearing all these Greek names and trying to keep all of these genealogies of these gods, into a semblance of order. But they're also motivated by the fact that they're like, oh, yeah, I've heard of him before. Oh, that's the god of this. Oh, that was in Percy Jackson. I mean, let's be honest. So by the time, they get, again, to 6th or 7th grade, they're just flying through it. And my kids give the best narrations from these. I remember one time my oldest son said, why are we even reading these? And I thought he was bored. They're difficult. And I said, what do you mean? He was like, basically, I just found out that Shakespeare ripped Romeo and Juliet from Bullfinch. Just kind of like seeing the parallels and seeing the relationships between disciplines, and the fact that writers and thinkers and people have influenced each other across geography and across time. And that is one of the best lessons that they can come away with, besides the lesson that you can learn anything you want to learn as long as you can read and comprehend what you're reading. Okay, I just want to cover a few more subjects that we do with literature without textbooks, and talk you through how we might do those. But again, if you go to the Ambleside Online website, a lot of this is explained in the schedules. It will say to do this, and then there'll be a footnote on how to implement it. And also Charlotte Mason's writings are all free on there, and a lot of places on there have ideas of hers summarized, so you don't have to read the full volume to understand what she found to work so well with her students. So we do nature study as one aspect of science study, and it's really the first science that we do is nature study, because children are captivated by nature and they understand it innately in some ways. So we do nature study by focusing on a subject for a term. We do terms instead of semesters, 3 terms a year, 12 weeks each. And we focus on a subject that term, and that may mean that we read some books about that subject, or it may mean that we just keep an eye out for it out in nature if it's something that is present where we live in our region. This last year, our topics were reptiles for first term, lakes, rivers, and oceans, I think, for second term, and then third term were weeds and flowers. So this third term, which we're in right now, we're getting ready for gardening. And so, if we didn't use any kind of extra, we could still focus on gardening easily. And if you didn't have a garden, you could focus on container gardening, or just taking a nature walk and observing the plants that are outside around you, coming back and looking them up and figuring out what they are and drawing them in your nature journal. It could be as simple as that. But there's a lot of scientific skills that are incorporated in nature study. Observation, asking questions and finding answers. You can focus on the scientific method if you want to get them used to that systematically, but taking those observations and recording them in a field journal or a nature journal, paying real close attention to details. There's a lot of things that are covered just kind of in a by the way manner with nature study. This next year, one of the assigned topics is invertebrates, and another might be fish or something like that. And I decided to combine those into a little bit longer study on marine biology, because we live near the ocean. It's been a while since we've really had an opportunity to study some of the things that are naturally available to us. So we are going to go on a whale watch, and we are going to have a marine biologist friend of ours take us tide pooling and talk to us about the creatures there. We're already quite familiar with a lot of the tide pool creatures because we have done that many times just for fun, but she's a marine biologist, so she's going to talk to us about some of the things we may not notice. And also she's going to describe to us the sort of things scientists look for when they're making scientific observations and noting them in their journals or their field guides. Nature study is something that is fun for me and comes pretty naturally. And so I don't have a hard time implementing this, but I know a lot of people who maybe aren't very outdoorsy or aren't science-minded would rely on some nice picture books for introducing the various nature concepts that they want to introduce. And you still don't need a textbook to find picture books. I'm going to talk in the second to last section here in a minute about where I go for my ideas. We also read a lot of poetry, and there's a lot of poetry available for free online that's public domain, but you can also just get an anthology of poetry and go through each of those poems and just enjoy them in a very relaxed way. I'm going to do an entire series about poetry in the near future because we love poetry. We do poetry tea time most days. In fact, my children are having tea time without me right now as I record this. And poetry is not something that feels like a chore to them, and I'm so thankful for it. So I will give lots of tips for enjoying poetry in another video. We do foreign languages. We start with Latin, and we do Latin via storybook with Lingua Latina, or sometimes visual Latin or another Latin curriculum. And also we do Spanish as a family, and I try and incorporate as much story as I can, you know, with vocabulary and with foreign languages, and also with math, as I'll talk about later. There is some repetition necessary for memorization as well as using it in context. And so with languages, we do need a little bit more guidance, I have found, because I'm not fluent in the languages that I know. I do have a degree in Japanese, and so I started trying to teach my children Japanese from an early age instead of Spanish, but we just don't have very many Japanese people in our community, and I had a really hard time finding opportunities for them to hear it from anyone other than me and to see it in use so that they understood that this isn't just a subject I'm teaching them, but this is like the primary mode of communication for an entire part of the world, you know? And when they're real little, I do think that immersion is the best. So I had to kind of compromise, and we do Spanish now because it's a lot easier to find Spanish resources and Spanish speakers here, but also where we used to live in Kansas City. And then Latin, of course, nobody speaks, so we don't have to worry about that, but we are Catholic, and so they do encounter Latin occasionally through our religious studies. We cover music by studying composers, again in a biographical way, learning about their lives and often reading storybooks about them. And through studying composers that are from the same time period, we get a feel for the time period of that composer and the different movements in musical history. And we also study folk songs and hymns. We sing the folk songs and hymns, and that gives them music theory. And then as they get a little bit older, we introduce piano. For art, we do artist study. Again, we read the biography about Michelangelo. This last term we did do Italian Renaissance and Flemish Renaissance. And so we got to see how similar artists were creating in the same time period and learn about their lives and how they kind of intersected a little bit, like with Michelangelo and Da Vinci. And we do art study where we look at art and then we talk about it. Sometimes we'll look at it and we'll try and memorize as much of it as we can, and then we'll talk about it. But art, looking at art and talking about it and learning about the lives of the composer is all we do for most of our art. And I feel like my children have a better grasp of art than I ever did, even though I loved art, and any other children that I know who don't do this method, who aren't very intrinsically motivated. Some children love art and they don't need any prompting. We also do handcrafts and we do drawing. So handcrafts would be kind of a, anything that's very practical and useful, but also artful. So we learn how to knit, and we learn how to sew, and we learn how to cut wood and burn wood, and we learn how to do some paper folding and things like that. But they're useful, right? And then drawing is difficult for me, so I have done not enough of it, but when I have done it, I have usually used some guidance, but you wouldn't have to. You could just focus on accurately recording what you see. But this is a good time to say, as a homeschool parent, you don't have to be your child's only teacher. So while we use literature and not textbooks in our home, if I chose to outsource something, like I do piano and art often, they do whatever they do because it's okay for my children to get other methods from other teachers and get to know that there's lots of different ways to learn, because who knows what's going to click with them. So I do often outsource things that I feel like it would be more work for me to learn how to master in order to teach them than is worth it. So in addition to the Ambleside Online curriculum, website, I like to just find books on the topics to offer to my children for free reading, and my children do read a lot on their own, and it's great, and I don't have strict restrictions. I let them read the things that other kids are reading, but I do offer them kind of assigned free reads. They don't have to talk to me about it. They don't have to do any, work with it, but they do have to read it. And for those books, I like to pull things from some specific resources that I'm going to share with you. The first book that I want to talk about is Give Your Child the World. This is by Jamie C. Martin, and I have this all tagged up. She has taken each region of the world and suggested books that I would consider living books for young, middle ages, and older kids. So I will pull from this, and often I'll check them out from the library, especially if they're picture books, because they're shorter. We're just going to read them together, or I'm just going to offer them and then, return them. But for the longer ones, occasionally I will buy them based on the recommendation of this book. And one summer we used this book to kind of create our own summer reading program, and where we traveled around the world. And that was really fun. This is a great resource to have. The very first book of book lists that I ever got on recommendation was Honey for a Child's Heart, and it has a lot of, the subtitle says, The Imaginative Use of Books in Family Life. So it is this idea of educating through books, whether you're homeschooling or not, and it has a lot of front matter, talking about why it's important to read, and how children grow when they read. And so that is just a really interesting study in philosophy that I recommend reading the front matter before you get into her annotated book list. But in her annotated book list, which is the second half of the book, she has categories like first books for beginning readers. So if that's where your child's at, you just go through and you read what she recommends, and then there's spaces to check off when you've bought it or when you've read it, and she lists which book awards they have won, which could be really nice because I like to read, for instance, Caldecott Medal books. She has a category on a book list for special occasions, so reading seasonally, basically reading, good books for different holidays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, etc. So also things about specific circumstances, like when a loved one has died. So this is a great book with lots of good recommendations, and I would say that she doesn't necessarily follow Charlotte Mason's principles on what is good literature, but that I have enjoyed most of the recommendations I've pulled from this, and this was an excellent starting point. Another book I want to recommend, I don't have my physical copy of. I think I lent it to someone, so if you have it, read it and then give it back to me if I told you to give it back to me. But if I told you to keep it, then keep it. Just do whatever I said. So is The Read Aloud Family by Sarah McKenzie. She is the creator of Read Aloud Revival, which is an excellent resource all on its own, and she has tons of book lists for free on her website, so I will link that and definitely check it out. But The Read Aloud Family is a book of book lists that is absolutely great to pull from for pleasure reading and for school reading. And one last book that is not a book of book lists, but I do pull inspiration from it regularly because I reread it all the time. It's For the Children's Sake by Susan Schaefer Macaulay. She goes through Charlotte Mason's philosophy and also some of her own thoughts on how to treat children as people and not just little computers that need to be filled with programs, and how to really captivate their imagination through literature. This is an older edition. What has happened is that I buy this book every time I see it, and then I give it away as soon as I possibly can, and then I buy it again and then give it away. So the last book that I found was an older edition, and so get the updated edition if you can, but the older edition is fine as well. It's pretty short, and it's an excellent introduction for anyone who wants to homeschool, but also it is not necessarily written for homeschoolers. So if you are a school teacher looking to implement more literature in your classroom, this would still be a great book to read. She does come at this from a Christian perspective, so forewarning, this certainly may not be for everyone, but I do think that everyone can get things out of it, and every person that I have recommended it to who has read it and given me feedback, or I've heard their feedback elsewhere, has found it to be a treasure. So this is an excellent place to start as well. Okay, as promised, we're going to talk about math. There are a few options for teaching math through a narrative storytelling style. So Life of Fred is a set of a lot of books, a lot of books, and you only have to buy them once, no matter how many children you have, which is great. And it follows a 5-year-old university professor named Fred, so it's obviously silly. And he introduces math concepts, and at the end of every chapter, there are a few questions in a section called Your Turn to Play. And the idea is just that the kids are encountering these concepts through his funny stories, and then they get to do some application of the ideas in their own way from the questions. And you can keep a separate math journal and record your answers for those questions. And I know people who have used this all the way up, and it does go into high school, so you could certainly use this series. We have used it some, but my kids reach a point where it's just too silly for them, and it's always been too silly for me. And then there are curricula that are supposed to be more Charlotte Mason friendly or literature based, where it is a textbook, but the beginning of each chapter lesson, so beginning of each lesson, like this one is lesson 14, division with a remainder, it has a little continuation of a story that goes through all the books. This one in particular, Math Lessons for a Living Education, follows twins and twin siblings as they grow and encounter these different lessons. And so you'll have, you know, a 2-page blurb of part of their story, and there are exercises after each renewal of the story element that last for the rest of the week. We also have lots of narrative style math supplements. It's fun to get picture books that talk about different math elements, and those can be really great addition to your math curriculum, especially for the younger kids. These are really popular. Circumference and the Dragon of Pi, Circumference and all the King's Tens, and Circumference and the First Round Table. These are cleverly illustrated, fun little short stories that introduce a concept, a math concept, and so they're called math adventures. But those types of books I don't feel like will give you a systematic overview of math without any holes, and so we tend to use a pretty dry math book curriculum that covers all the basics, and then find fun ways to incorporate it in our everyday lives or use it in realistic situations, like when we're doing, you know, telling time and we have to just determine what's 8 hours from now or whatever. When we are doing division and I give them, you know, a certain snack that has little pieces, how do you divide it between 4 people, you know, things like that. So we do try and make it real and fun like any good math teacher would, but we do use an actual curriculum for math. Okay, well, I talked so long that I had to stop and recharge my battery, so I hope that you got a lot out of this and that you have a good understanding of how we do homeschool without any kind of curriculum, with the exception of math, though we tried valiantly not to use a math curriculum. It didn't work out for us. And I'd love to know what questions you have. You know, how do you cover this without buying a curriculum? To answer a question that could come up, we could do this whole curriculum with just things from the library, but we do own books. So, you know, we do definitely still spend money, and we spend money on experiences, but we don't buy any kind of box curriculum. And the Ambleside Online curriculum is actually just a book list and some suggestions on what to do with these works of literature. So leave me a comment and tell me what you do for your literature-based homeschooling, whether it's every subject or just some subjects. Let's have a conversation in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss future videos talking about children's literature or literature in general, and that upcoming series that I plan on doing on how to enjoy poetry. So let me know if you're doing this activity as well. Thank you, Nina, for giving us the prompt to record the video about this, and I'll see you next video.